Thing? That the last thing? Okay, another thing about the West. Now remember, the West keeps moving on us. All right. Right now we're defining the West as west of the Mississippi River, about to the Rocky Mountains River, about to the Rocky Mountains. That's the West. That's the Great Plains, what is usually called the Great Plains or Prairie States. All right, which has a similar geography. Okay, it was thought to be uninhabitable really for farming, which is what we were. We were largely an agricultural farming country. So, but you do come to see things kind of coming together here. After the Civil War, you start seeing, especially up in the north, in the northeast, I'm talking about in the northeast, you see a growing kind of diet for beef. Okay, and this is kind of how we became such great beef eaters with, you know, McDonald's on every corner and all these hamburger places, and which probably aren't very healthy. But you start seeing a growing taste for beef after the Civil War. And see, before that, most Americans, when they ate meat, there was a lot of pork. Pigs were cheap, easy to raise, not very healthy, but, you know, pork was cheap, easy to raise, that kind of thing. Chicken, some kind of poultry, of course, wild game, any kind of wild game, duck or, you know, pheasant, stuff like that. But in terms of cattle, you know, cows was for what? Milk, right? Cows made milk. Nobody's slaughtering cows all over the place, making hamburgers out of them. But after the Civil War, this begins to change, and so with a market growing for beef, what happens here is this helps open up what we call the West too. In that, what develops after Civil War is called the open range system. It's called the open range system. And this is really how we became such, you know, big beef eaters with hamburgers and all that kind of stuff. It's called open range. What happens is, going back, you got to take this back a little bit. And it really goes back to Texas. Now, Texas was part of the province then of Mexico, which was part of the Spanish Empire, right? And then Mexico won its independence from the Spanish Empire. I think it was in the early 1820s, right? About 1820, 1821, I think, somewhere in there. But Mexico wins its independence, and of course at that time Texas was still part of Mexico, as was California and all that kind of stuff. But when the Spanish settled Mexico, they brought with them, horses and other stuff, and they brought cattle with them. All right, there wasn't any cattle there before. But in the Texas area, which was then northern Mexico, Texas was hardly inhabited at all. It was very sparsely inhabited. It was mainly inhabited by some Native Americans, and there were just thousands and thousands and thousands of wild cows, really, just wild cows, just kind of roaming around. Well, what happens here is you see the development of what becomes the open range system, or what we call the cattle drive. The cattle drive. There's been all kinds of TV shows made about this, and movies made about the cattle drive, right? I think an old TV series called Rawhide. There's been a bunch of them. Okay. What happens is you get these companies that then organize and they round up these wild cattle. There were kind of these, at the time, they were these kind of skinny, longhorn steer, you know. And actually, we probably wouldn't eat one today. You know, we like ours full of steroids and beefed up, you know, full of water and stuff. But these were pretty just skinny and wild, tough beef. But nonetheless, you know, they would round up about 3,500 head of cattle, and they had trails that left various different kinds of trails. They had names like the Chisholm Trail and this kind of trail, the Goodnight Trail. They had different trails, but they would come out of Texas and they would drive these cattle, and it was very dangerous. Then you had stampedes, and then you had weather that could make them stampedes. You could be attacked. But they would drive about 3,500, sometimes 5,000 head of cattle, and they would drive them up out of Texas. And they would, a real famous cow town was Abilene, Kansas, okay, because that's where the railroad was, all right? That's where the railroad was. They would drive these cattle out of Texas, and this was over hundreds of miles. Very dangerous work. Abilene, Kansas, okay? And that's where the railroad was, and they would drive these cattle, and then once they get them there, they would then, sell them off, and they would then be put on the railroad and then be taken to really the Midwest, like Cincinnati, Chicago, West, where they would be butchered. All right, they would be butchered and distributed. But this is how you kind of get the beef industry in this country. This is the way it kind of starts. By the way, the cowboys is kind of interesting. You had, of course, white cowboys. You had many black cowboys. This was very multicultural. This was very diverse. You had white cowboys, black cowboys, Hispanic cowboys. You had cowboys that had served in the Union Army. You had cowboys that served in the Confederate Army, all kind of thrown in together. It was very diverse. It's very multicultural and very equal. It was just, they all were just in this together because it was very dangerous work. And it was a really hard job. It was really a job for young men. If you got older, you probably couldn't do it because it was just really hard, very dangerous. This food is terrible. You don't have toilet facilities or anything like that. And so what they would usually do once they got to Abilene, they would get paid. All right, they would finally, once the cowboys got there, of course they're dirty and nasty and everything. And they were sleeping out every night. And once they got there, then they got paid. And then that's when the cow town came to life, right? Because they just got paid. And what are they going to do? They're going right to the bars and the saloons, and they're going to blow it. It's going to be booze, gambling, prostitutes, you name it. All right, they're going to blow it. So then they would just blow it, and then they would drift back to Texas. They'd get hired back on by another company, and they do the same thing over and over again until they got too old to do it. All right, and usually that didn't take long because this is a job that would wear you out real quick. Sometimes kill you. So this is kind of the beginning of the beef industry. All right, and it was kind of a system. They call it the open range system, but they usually formed a kind of association. All right, they formed a kind of it was called the Cattlemen's Association. And they formed this kind of association because cattle rustling, as it was called, right, stealing cattle was a big business, what was called cattle rustling. Because you usually had so many head of cattle, it was hard to protect them all, and you would have robbers, picking off cattle and selling them. This was a real problem. This is something that, the great outlaws did. Billy the Kid was a cattle rustler. Some of these outlaws were involved in it. It was a real pain. So they formed a cattlemen's administration, which, every outfit had to come up with their own brand, right? They started branding the cattle, and you had to register your brand with the Cattlemen's Association so that you wanted to be able to tell the cattle apart, who's whose, but also it was trying to reduce thievery. It was trying to reduce cattle rustling. Because, if you're caught with somebody else's cow and it's got the brand on there, you could be accused of stealing that cow. And by the way, Western justice, as it was called, they usually weren't real fond of due process. And if you're caught stealing a horse or a cattle, you usually just got strung up pretty quick. You usually can get the trial by jury and all that stuff. They just hung you. I mean, Western justice was pretty rough. Okay, they didn't mess around. So this was kind of a way of kind of marking your cattle and trying to protect it against cattle rustlers, and also so that when cattle arrived in Abilene, Kansas, you could kind of separate the cattle out and make sure that everybody knows whose cattle are who, and you can sell them and so on and so forth. Now, what happens here is that this only lasts really, you start getting into about the 1880s, the open range system really begins to die. Okay, it really begins to die, and it begins to die for reasons. What you have happening is, one is you're getting more and more farmers by this point moving out there who are stringing up barbed wire, and they're it's making it hard for the free movement of cows, from Texas up to Kansas and so on, because, the farmers are starting to settle there. And we'll get into that in just a minute, and they're stringing up barbed wire like crazy, and so it hinders. And by the way, and again, this is something that movies have been made out of, you start getting wars between the farmers and the cattle guys. I mean, they're killing each other. I mean, they're in open warfare. You get these wars between the cattlemen and the farmers over the land, over the free movement of their. They didn't like this, right? The cattlemen didn't like this. But another problem that they had was the weather, and particularly, I think it was 1876. Now, out west, of course, you get blizzards, and that temperature can fall to 60 below zero, and the wind's blowing hard, and there was a particularly bad blizzard in 1876, and thousands of cattle died. They just couldn't get the food. They were, it's a blizzard, and it was a particularly bad blizzard, and that just about wiped out the cattle industry. I mean, it killed thousands and thousands of cattle. So what happens is that when you start getting into the 1880s, the whole open range system begins to change. And what happens is you get particularly British investors. You get British investors who are interested in this because they know they can make money. And what they start doing is they start, instead of driving cattle, keep driving cattle, they just developed these huge Ponderosa type ranches, okay? These kind of Ponderosa type ranches, huge ranches where cattle were stayed in one place and they were fed and then they were taken to market, okay? The cattle drive just kind of dries up. And so you start seeing the British invest in this, and they just say, hey, look, let's just develop these big ranches and keep them in one place. But over time, as you get into the late 19th century and into the 20th century, the beef industry just really takes off. And then once you get refrigeration come in, it takes off even more. Because once you're able to refrigerate this stuff, keep it from rotting away, then it really starts taking off when you get into the 20th century. So this is basically the beginning of the American beef industry, but it does help open up the West. Now of course I'm not going to get into this, but you got that whole gunfighter outlaw thing that goes on out there. Because the West is just largely untamed. You don't have real organized courts or justice or anything like this. It's usually referred to as extra legal. You get some very famous characters that movies have been made out of. That they kind of just make up their own law, right? It's not established law. You might have heard of Judge Roy Bean out of Texas. There's been 2 or 3 movies made about him. Judge Roy Bean, the law was what he said it was, right? And he hanged people when he thought it was the right thing to do, and he didn't lose any sleep over it. And of course, you got the whole outlaw culture with, Billy the Kid, and that lives long in our legends and in the movies, and Wild Bill Hitchcock, and you get these things. What was his name? John Wesley Hardin, another famous killer. Both of them were serial killers, to tell you the truth. They were just murderers, right? These psychopaths. A lot of them were just flat out psychopaths, but we tend to glorify them in our movies and TV shows because it's just fascinating, right? It's just fun to make movies out of them. But the Wild West is the kind of Wild West because you don't really have any real established law for quite a while like you do in the East. So that takes time. Extra legal means it's outside the law. It's whatever the law says it is. For example, in the East, you probably wouldn't be hanged for stealing a horse, but you would be hanged for stealing a horse if you did it in Montana or Wyoming or North Dakota, right? You could get yourself hanged for that. So it's a different kind of law. And there's a lot of lawlessness out there. Right? There was considerable lawlessness out there, and that would take time to come. Now we get to really, Wyatt Earp was another one we've made a lot of shows and movies about. Wyatt Earp was another one that Jesse James, of course, big, huge. You get all these stories and stuff coming out from out there. But the real hero that really bring about the change out west, and they're not real sexy to talk about, but they're the real heroes. They're the ones who really make the West, what was called the Great American Desert, right? It was originally called the Great American Desert. These are the ones who make it bloom, and that's just the farmer. And they're the ones who make it work. So let's get into this, the farmers. How does this work? Now remember, originally that area between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains was considered uninhabitable. It wasn't suitable for farming. And that's why when you get the wagon trains going out west, they usually went through the Great American Desert. They're trying to get to the Oregon Territory. They're trying to get to California, right? But what happens here is to try to get farming families out there, at least try to get them to make a stab at it. Again, this is at the beginning of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln has become president. But he did, while trying to manage the Civil War, but he did sign an act that passed Congress in 1862. And this is called the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act of 1862, signed by Abraham Lincoln, passed by Congress, signed by Abraham Lincoln. Now, of course, by this time, his hands are full with the Civil War, but this is an important act, because what Congress is trying to do is to try to provide an incentive to get families to move out to what was considered to be just a real forsaken place. Right? And what was the deal? The deal was this. This is to try to entice people to move out there. Right? This is to try to get families, especially families, to try to get families to move out there. And that is, you could get at least 160 acres of land, okay, for a very small fee. Usually it's like $5. Very small fee. You could get 100. Sometimes you could get more. But you could get at least 100. So it's just dirt cheap, right? 160 acres of land for $5. It was just a little fee. And you would, maybe move out to North Dakota, South Dakota, something like that, get 160 acres, and what you had to do was this. You had to go out there, you had to live on it for 5 years, okay? In order for it to become yours, you had to live on it for 5 years, you had to stay on the land, and you had to put up a permanent structure of some kind. Okay, you had to put up some kind of permanent structure. It didn't have to be much, but you had to live on it for 5 years, and then that land became yours outright. Okay, so this was to try to get people to move out to what was considered to be just really terrible area, just a horrible, horrible area. And those early farmers were really up against it in the late 19th century especially. They were really up against it. Before you had technology, it was just awfully difficult to do. One difficulty that the real early farming families had, if you move out to North Dakota, South Dakota, even Montana, anything like that, you notice that one problem you're going to have is housing. Because there's no trees out there. Okay, this isn't like the East where you got lumber. You got trees, you got a lot of lumber, you got a lot of forests. The West doesn't have that. They're called the prairie states for a reason. It's because they don't have hardly any trees. It's flat, it's arid, okay? So you don't have any lumber really to build homes with. So what they did was, if you look at the old photographs that are in, I've got some stuff online that shows this. So these farming families, because of lack of lumber, remember you don't have any railroads, have not penetrated out there yet to bring you any of this stuff. So they basically built their houses out of the earth, which was called sod, right? The earth is, you know, the earth out there, the soil out there is really hard packed. It's packed real hard. It's sod. So you see sod houses. It looks like an igloo. Look, it looks like just igloo built right out of the sod, right? And if you look at old pictures of these farming families and they're out in the middle of nowhere, you know, they'll have a cow grazing on top of their house, you know, because they just built it right out of a little hillside or something. It's just, you know, it's dirt, it's dirty, it's could be just filthy. It gets real dry out there. So, and by the way, these early farmers they oftentimes were called sod busters. They were referred to as sod busters. Right? Because that's what they got to work with. That's the kind of soil, it's this hard sod, this hard earth. This is what they're up against. They were up against a lot of difficulties here. And they just had to dig these houses out of the ground. That's about all they could do. It's very, very difficult. When it did rain or snow, this stuff's going to leak in on them. It's going to be very dirty. It's going to be nasty. You don't have toilet facilities, you don't have showers, you don't have anything like that. Right? It's just nothing like that. And that's another problem, is water. If you go out west, you get periods of droughts. In the summertime especially, you don't get much rain. You don't get much rain. And then in the wintertime, you can get blizzards. And then you get feet, you know, you get snow measured in feet, right? Not just in inches, but in feet. But in the summer, it's really dry, right? So water's a problem. So what they tried to do, these early farmers tried to do, was at least try to collect the rain they did get. You know, they tried to collect it and hold on to it. But what would happen is that oftentimes this water became stagnated. And, you know, you got people drinking from the same water as the animals. And so a big problem was you got sick, right? Contaminated water, it's called what? And Europeans had a lot of trouble with this, right? The Europeans had horrible trouble with this. It's called cholera, right? It's contaminated water. It's unsanitized water. You run a high fever and it kills you. This would break out in London. London had a terrible time. They lost thousands of people to cholera. It's just contaminated water. And so this is a real problem in a very arid area. And so water's it's a big deal. It's just until they're able to drill deep wells, until that technology comes, water's going to be a real struggle. All right, as is housing. But cholera could kill you pretty quick because you run that high fever and it kills kids like crazy. All right, it kills kids just like crazy. Another problem is fuel. So those early families, you know, if you don't have trees, you don't have lumber, you got nothing to burn. And it gets, like I said, it gets in the wintertime, it gets way below zero in the wintertime. See, out there you got extremes of winter. In the summer it's really, really hot and dry. In the wintertime it is just blizzards, right? 60 below. It's just real extreme. You have very long winters. Okay, the winter can hit pretty early out there. And oftentimes you could go almost till June before you really start feeling, you know, any kind of spring and summer. I mean, it can go a long time. You got long winters. So fuel is a huge problem. Just trying to stay alive and try to win burn, you know. Oftentimes they would use cattle, if they had cattle, or buffalo manure. Okay, chips, you know. Cow chips, buffalo chips. It's just manure. They would dry out the patties, dry it out, and you would burn those as Fuel. There's a famous picture that I sometimes see in textbooks of there's a woman out on the prairie. She's all dressed. She's got her bonnet on. And she's all dressed up long, long sleeves and long dress. But she's out on the prairie, and she's got a wheelbarrow. It's a famous picture. And she's picking up these big manure piles and putting them in the wheelbarrow. But she's holding the wheelbarrow. It's full of cow patties or buffalo patties or something. But the wind's blowing in her face, and when the picture was snapped, she's going like this. Because that stink from the manure's blowing right in her face. And they snapped the picture, and she's kind of looking away. But, imagine burning that all winter and thinking what you smelled like, with no showers or clean. You probably smelled like one big buffalo chip or cow chip by the time this was done, right? But who cares, right? You all smell like that anyways, right? But that's a problem. Fuel is a huge, huge problem, especially when it gets cold. And of course, go along with that is the weather. Like I said, very extremes in weather. Pretty hot, dry in the summer, very, very cold. Droughts. Okay, you always hate droughts. You're always at the mercy of the weather. Droughts were a real problem. Another one, and this is one you don't really hear a lot about. What was really terrifying, and you still see this in many parts of the world. And these things are just unbelievable. Are the locusts? Okay, the locusts, and the locusts were just terrifying. It was like watching a horror movie. Because if you ever watch some documentaries on this, they'll kind of hover in the air for a while. They block out the sun. There's so many of them, they can block out the sun. They kind of hover. It's like hundreds of thousands of millions of them. They just kind of hover, and then they hit the ground, and then they just march across the ground, and they eat everything in their path, and they'll eat anything. So if your crops are out, they're gone. They'll eat your hat. They'll eat anything. They just march across the landscape, and they're terrifying by the millions. And when those hit, they would wipe you out in a second. Now they don't have that much trouble today because they've kind of cultivated the soil enough that it's disturbed their habitat. Of course, they got insecticides and all that kind of stuff. But this was a big fear. Locusts were a big fear, and they were just absolutely terrifying. Now, a lot of these families, some of the early ones, they just kind of gave up. Some of them went insane from the isolation. There are stories of insane, people just going nuts, because you're so isolated. Usually there's nobody around you. But slowly the farming begins to take off because that hard sod out in the prairie that everybody thought was worthless, that everybody thought was just desert, that sod, even though it was hard, that sod was actually very rich. And what they developed was finally a plow that could dig into the sod and turn it over. And once they were able to develop sods that could penetrate that soil and turn it over, and then they can plant the seed, usually wheat, it's usually grains, wheat, barley, all that kind of stuff. They found out that soil was really rich. And so once they were able to get the plows that could really chop into that soil and turn it over, then they were off and running. And also getting the technology where they could drill deep wells so that they could get the water out of the ground. Okay. Then you get the penetration of the railroad. And the penetration of the railroad brings life to them. Right? So they're not so isolated. They can get their crops to market. They can get cattle. Also, the railroad brings culture to them. Because by the time you turn the 20th century, you get catalogs. These farming families would have a Sears and Roebuck catalog, and they could order carpet, pianos, anything, they just order it, and the train would come. Right? It connected them to culture and civilization that they had never known. So the penetration of the railroad. Another thing that really helped them a lot, sounds kind of quaint, this was a life-saving invention for these farmers. It was actually invented, barbed wire was invented by an American inventor. Named Joseph Glidden. And it seemed like such a simple thing, but barbed wire will be a lifesaver for these farmers. And it's still used abundantly today. It was, at first farmers were skeptical of barbed wire because they thought their cattle was so stupid that the cattle would run into the barbed wire and tear themselves up. But it was tested in San Antonio, Texas. It was tested. They ran a bunch of cattle through town with barbed wire strung up, and the cattle stopped. Cattle didn't try to run down the barbed wire. Cattle had enough sense to stop. So that the farmers thought, well, okay, maybe the cattle aren't going to get themselves wrapped up in it and tear themselves up in it. So this was really cheap stuff. Barbed wire was remember, farmers are usually poor. They're usually in debt. But it was cheap enough for farmers to purchase this stuff. And it was a kind of an interesting slogan. Joseph Glidden sold this stuff. He had a really good campaign. His advertising said, I think this is really good. He said that barbed wire was lighter than air, stronger than whiskey, and cheaper than dirt, which is not a bad advertising campaign. Lighter than air, stronger than whiskey, cheaper than dirt. And it was cheap. It was cheap enough. So they were able to string this stuff up, and it helped keep their cattle in, of course, and keep other stuff out. Now, the ranchers hated this. The cattle drive guys hated this stuff. They hated this stuff because it kept them from free moving their cattle back and forth. And that caused wars between the cattlemen and the farmers because they were stringing this stuff up all over the place by the time they got out there. But this stuff was a real godsend for the farmers, barbed wire. It was just super, and it was just so cheap. They just strung this stuff up like crazy all over. I see this with it. It always amazes me sometimes. If I'm driving to Florida or something, I'll kind of look over. I'll see barbed wire strung up mile after mile after mile after mile after mile. This stuff's, it just never ends. I mean, if you're really paying attention, if you're driving somewhere, notice all the barbed wire that's just strung up along the highway as you're heading somewhere. It just amazes me how much it's strung up. People just use it to fence off their land everywhere. It's still hugely popular. So, it's these guys, what I'm getting at here. It's these guys who really turn the great American desert into the great American breadbasket. Because this is where our wheat is grown, this is where our barley is grown, this is where other products are grown, cattle, of course. It's these guys who make the desert bloom. These are the guys, after a hard start, it takes a while, but these are the guys who really turn this huge area in the heart of the country, into the most productive, probably the most productive agricultural area in the world, because they produce so much stuff that we have to export this stuff, right? They grow a lot more than we can eat, that's for sure. So this is big. This was huge in the development of the country. This makes the United States the #1 agricultural country in the world. This makes the United States the #1 agricultural country in the world by far. So that's the West. And of course, with that, this really helps us become a great industrial power. And that's what I'm getting into now. So we're going to now switch into really what is the third essay question on your review sheet. Should you decide to answer, take the notes on it. And now I'm not getting into politics and stuff for a while because, quite frankly, those late 19th century presidents are pretty weak. They're minor. They're okay, but I mean, they're pretty weak, they're pretty minor. Basically what's going on in the late 19th century is the presidents are controlled by Congress, and the Congress is controlled by the corporations. And so you get a whole, between Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt in the late 19th century, you get a series of pretty weak presidents. And so I'm not even going to mess with them till we get to Theodore Roosevelt at the beginning of the 20th century, all right? What I want to focus on is the real action, and this is the part of your essay question, the third essay question on the review sheet. And this is where the real action is, and that's urbanization. The country is slowly shifting from an agricultural to a urban country, all right? But urbanization, huge immigration, huge, big time immigration. Okay, of course, with urbanization you get industrialization, okay? And then I throw in there too some social thought, the rise of social Darwinism, which is bad news because it just reinforces the racism in the country. You probably, if you take sociology, you probably run into social Darwinism, all right, which just reinforces the racism, which is pretty bad throughout the country. So let's kind of launch into this then with the immigration, urbanization. It all ties together. Immigration, urbanization, and industrialization. It all ties in together. Okay, so we're after the Civil War, we get into massive immigration. Okay, and this is really important because immigration is still on the hot burner today, especially so-called undocumented or illegal. But let's kind of take a look at this. What you have is before the Civil War, you had what was called the old immigration. Okay, this is pre-immigration. This is before the Civil War. All right, and most of the immigration, this is the old immigration before the Civil War, and it's different than the new immigration. Okay, this is the old immigration. This is different than the new. In other words, now I'm generalizing a lot here. Okay, you're going to find exceptions to everything I say because I have to generalize. But the old immigration before the Civil War, it's mainly Northern and Western European. Of course, African, because of the slave trade and slavery in the South. Okay, it's mainly Northern and Western European. It is African. You do get, before the Civil War, because we mentioned the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and that kind of thing, you do get some Irish. You do get some Chinese. Okay, and you probably get, but this is kind of pretty much it. Now, when I say Northern and Western, of course, I'm talking British, English, Scottish or Scots-Irish. Scot from Scotland, or what is sometimes referred to as Scots-Irish, but particularly British. Germany is big. The Germans are really big. Okay, the Germans, they just keep coming. The Germans keep coming. So they're really big in this. But this is kind of the old immigration. Now, after the Civil War, it begins to change. All right, you start seeing this begin to change. This is called the new immigration. Oh, by the way, a lot of these people are literate. Okay, and they may not be able to read English, but they can read in their own language. All right, they're literate in their own language. All right, and so they tend to be literate. Very heavily on Protestants. Okay, pretty heavy on the Protestants, but of course you do get Catholics and you do get Jews. But pretty heavy on Protestants. All right, pretty heavy on the Protestants. As this begins to change as you get to the new immigration after the Civil War. And by the way, this comes in, it sometimes comes in waves, but it comes in let me put it this way, the immigrants come in manageable numbers, okay? They come in kind of manageable numbers, right? It's not real overwhelming. Okay, it's not real overwhelming. They kind of come in, pretty manageable numbers. Okay? Now, the new immigration is different. That's after the Civil War. and well into the 20th century. Okay? This is after the Civil War, and then into the 1920s when we started getting tough. You started getting hard on it. All right? Because it becomes a political issue, unfortunately. It becomes a political issue, unfortunately, new immigration. With the new immigration, this is what we'll be focusing on. As far as the European immigration, it now shifts from Northern and Western Europe. It now shifts to Southern and Eastern Europe. Okay, Southern. And by the way, when Americans, we got this kind of genealogical craze that's been going on for several decades now, especially with Ancestry.com, and it started by Roots, the famous book written by Alex Haley about the African American experience, and then it kind of ticked off this genealogical craze that's been going on since the 1970s. And most Americans trace their ancestry to the new immigration, not the old. Most of them just trace it to after the Civil War, because that's when the great overwhelming numbers of immigrants come. It comes after the Civil War, not before. So, most of the immigrants from Europe are coming not from Northern and Western Europeans, they're coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Who are we talking about here? A lot of Italians. Now the Germans keep coming. As a matter of fact, up through World War I, the number one group were German Americans. Then Italians replaced them, and then, others, Hispanic, it changes, right? But Germans were number one for quite a while, all right? The German Americans were number one. Okay, Southern and Eastern Europe, we're talking a lot of Italians, but also a lot of those coming from the so-called, from Southeastern Europe, the Balkan states, Serbians, Croats, Greeks, Turks, okay, Bulgarians, that whole kind of Balkans part of Europe, what is called, we got a lot of little countries down in there. It's very mountainous and poor, all right, very poor. Also, a lot of Eastern European Jews, especially from the Russian Empire. Okay, now keep in mind the Russian Empire at that time included Poland. It included Poland, it included Lithuania, it included Latvia, it included Estonia, it included those Baltic states. The Russians harshly, under the Tsars, the Russians harshly persecuted the Jews, very much. So if they could get out, many of the Jews in the Russian Empire come to the United States. Okay, so you get a lot of Russian and Eastern European Jews coming in through Ellis Island. Okay, I got videos up of this, by the way. Got a series of different videos up on it. So you get a lot coming in during that period, during this new immigration, a whole lot. You get a lot of, by the way, they are really, really poor. Okay, very poor. A lot of them are coming through Ellis Island up in New York, right, which is now a tourist attraction. They're coming through and they got nothing. All right, they got nothing. They're extremely poor. All right, extremely poor. The large number of Catholics, and like I said, Jews. Okay, a lot more Catholics, especially with the Italians. Of course, tend to be Catholic. But a lot more Catholic that they're coming in. Not only are they poor, but they tend to be totally uneducated, illiterate. Okay, uneducated, illiterate. Because most of them were simply laborers. Okay, back in their home countries, they were just laborers. Uneducated. No, they can't even read and write in their own language. They can't even read and write in their own language. Totally uneducated. They're just poor, uneducated, illiterate people who are just trying to get a new life, right? Try to get over here and start over again. But they are very poor. They're very usually illiterate. They tend to be, since they're coming from a different part of Europe. See, this part of Europe tends to have parliaments, representative government, okay? This part of Europe tends to have autocracies, kings and queens, top bottom, not much democracy, not much representative government. So they're coming from very authoritarian governments. Okay, they're really confused by American politics. They're not used to it. They're coming from countries where they are constantly told what to do. Because they have no representative government. They don't have civil rights. They don't have constitutions. They're coming from very authoritarian areas, all right? So their whole mindset is they're kind of bewildered when they get off the boat and they go through Ellis Island, and then it's like, okay, what do I do? They don't have any direction, right? They don't understand. They're illiterate, they're poor, they can't even speak English. Most of them can't speak any kind of English. And here's the big one, and they come in overwhelming numbers. Overwhelming numbers. This is sometimes called immigrant shock. Immigrant shock. They're coming over by the millions. This is called immigrant shock. They're coming over by the millions. Right? They're just flooding in because our doors are pretty well open. All right. Also in this, the main non-European group. Now, before the Civil War, it's the Chinese. After the Civil War, it's the Japanese. Now, of course, the Japanese. Now, remember, before the Civil War, the Chinese, they land on the West Coast, right? They're coming through California, right? They're not going through Ellis Island in New York, right? The Japanese, pretty similar. The Japanese are coming through, they are largely Hawaii is where they're immigrating to, which was an American territory. It wasn't a state yet. And, of course, California. All right, that's where they're landing. All right, Hawaii, many of them settle in Hawaii. Hawaii has a large Japanese immigrant history. And California, of course. So the non-European is largely Japanese, all right? Now, as you get this, the big thing I want you to remember about this, it's these folks that provide the cheap labor under horrible circumstances, terrible pay, horrible working conditions. These are the folks that really make the American Industrial Revolution. This is the backbone of the American Revolution. American Industrial Revolution. These are the guys working the sweatshops, the horrible factories, the textile mills, the mines, which were totally unsafe. The mines, they provide the cheap labor that fuels the American Industrial Revolution. The American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution is really built upon the backs of immigrant labor. So much of it, under horrible conditions, under horrible pay, terrible, sometimes facing discrimination as the Irish did. But they are really they're the ones working in those mills, the textile mills, and the canning industries, the lumber industries. All this is them. This is what provides that cheap labor for so long. That, the so-called captains of industry are going to rely upon. We'll get into them in just a minute. So, as they're coming through here, now, at first this is wide open in the late 19th century. Then about the 1880s, they start doing some health checks, at least kind of looking over the immigrants to see if they got any contagious diseases in the 1880s. Try to quarantine those who might have something that looks kind of funny, all right, to give kind of a quick look over. But the first exclusion really comes with the Chinese. Now you start seeing this tighten up. The Chinese are the first to get hit. The Chinese are the first to start getting hit with severe quotas, okay? That is, basically, all the Chinese were excluded by about 1882. And this is going to expand. It hits the Chinese first, but then it begins to expand to other groups as we go along. But the Chinese are the first to get hit. All right? As things kind of get to tighten up. All right? As things begin to tighten up. Now, where are they going? Alright, now I'm talking mainly the ones that come through Ellis Island and into New York, right? When they get off the boat, they're poor, they got nothing, they're illiterate, they don't know English and whatever. So basically, first of all, they're going to crowd into the cities, whether it be New York City, Chicago, other cities that have large immigrant populations, even Louisville, Cincinnati, Detroit. They're going to be crowded into these inner cities. And so they then they live in these very poor, what are called dumbbell tenement housing. Dumbbell tenement housing. Dumbbell tenement houses. These are massive apartment buildings that go on for blocks. They go on for blocks. Just big, ugly apartment buildings that go on for blocks. Really no toilet facilities. No hardly any heat, air conditioning. A lot of them are living in cellars, basements, horrible conditions. Disease spreads very quickly through these things. No amenities really. Pretty foul, with all the smells and so on. Remember, folks, in the late 19th century, even into the early 20th century, you don't have city services. You don't have organized. Fire departments and police in a lot of these places. You don't have, the sanitation is horrendous. Keep in mind that we didn't even know what germs were until the late 19th century. We had no idea what germs and viruses were until the 1880s and 1890s. Didn't have a clue. Right? People got malaria, diphtheria, polio, and all these childhood diseases, measles, and chickenpox. Smallpox had been pretty much contained, but these killed people just right and left in these. They're crowded into these tenement houses. Whole families just crowded in, right? And then working at jobs that were very unhealthful. Working 12 hours a day at least, probably at least. Now. And fires were very frequent. Fires were a constant problem. In 1871, you had the famous Chicago fire that really burned down practically the whole city. The famous Chicago fire practically burned down all of Chicago. And this was a real problem everywhere. Fire, because people were always burning something, right? You didn't have electricity, didn't have gas. Gas was just coming in, then later electricity. But you constantly had fires. They were just we had an awful lot of courthouses burned down in this country. Right? A lot of courthouses burned down in this country. It just were constant problems, all right? So, because you didn't have organized civil services. City government wasn't very well organized into this kind of stuff. This is just coming in. Now, what the big cities relied upon was really what we call the political machine. Okay? New York City, Chicago, other cities, other major cities relied upon what was called the political machine. That is, you usually had one political party that dominated the politics of that particular city. And I'm just going to give you one example. But it could be Democratic Party, it could be Republican Party, but you usually had one political party that dominated the politics of that particular city. Now, in the East and Midwest, it was usually the Democratic Party. All right, but not always. In the Midwest, it could be the Republican Party. All right? But let's just take New York City, since that was the city with a lot of the immigrants, right? New York City's known for that. So in New York City, it was controlled by the Democratic Party, which had a nickname. It was called Tammany Hall. Okay, it was called Tammany Hall. I think I got too many N's in there, but Tammany, Tammany Hall. It was the Democratic Party political machine. It was usually referred to as Tammany Hall. But it was, in the case of New York City, and they also had this in Chicago, but this is the way, in the absence of social services. See, you don't have any social services, you don't have any of this stuff. So this kind of takes the place of it, but the problem is that this could be enormously corrupt. Okay, it can be enormously corrupt, because whenever you got one party controlling everything, it's going to lead to corruption. It always does. But it worked for the immigrants. It worked for the immigrants. Why? And the immigrants usually supported the political machine. All right. So, and this was very well organized. Let's say, I'm coming from Latvia, or I'm coming from Lithuania. I got a couple kids, family, very poor, can't speak English, illiterate, nothing. I get off, go through Ellis Island, I get off the boat, I'm looking at New York City. And looking at this vast, I don't know what the heck. Right? Oftentimes a person will come up to me and he'll start speaking my language. I'm going, whoa, that's kind of cool. Got somebody who knows my language, right? And he'll say, hey, I can find a place for you to live. There won't be much. I can get you a job. There won't be much, but it's a job. You won't starve. Right? And what he'll do is he'll gotta get you going. And he might bring you a turkey at Thanksgiving, bring you a ham at Christmas. He'll bail you out of jail when you blow your paycheck on Friday and get drunk and you're in the drunk tank and you need to get bailed out. He'll be there for you. Right? He'll get you when you get into trouble. Big thing is, he'll get you started on your naturalization papers. Because you got 5 years, right? 5 years. You want to get that process going because you want to become a U.S. citizen. So he's going to help you with the naturalization papers. Get that 5 years in. Right? You become a U.S. citizen. And what's he want from you? Around election time, he wants what? He wants your vote, and you're going to give it to him. You're going to get damn right. You're going to give it to him, and your children's going to give it to him because you really owe him. And that political machine is a machine because on election day, you're going to have a guy from the political machine knocking on your door saying, "Have you gotten out to vote today? You gotten out to vote today?" And he'll haul your butt down to the ballot box to make sure you vote. Okay, and you'll vote for him. You'll vote for whoever they tell you to vote for. The political machine in the United States lasts well into the 20th century. Now, progressives hated the political machine because the political machine could be enormously corrupt. You had bribery, graft, political corruption, but the immigrants didn't really care because in the absence of social services, this was their social service. Okay? So these last well into the 20th century. And it is, you just see, because what you have here is in the late 19th, especially in the early 20th century, is you got this unholy alliance. You got this corrupt alliance between local government and big business. They're in bed together, right? There's bribery everywhere. There's political corruption everywhere. And it's an alliance between the businesses and the political machine, okay? So what you have is a lot of graft, a lot of skimming off the budgets, okay? That's graft, a lot of bribery, because these businesses would pay bribes to the politicians so that they could build their buildings for them, right? They win their bids, right? It's not done on the up and up. So it's this collusion, this kind of incestuous thing between, and this is going to be a real problem in American cities across the country, where you got this alliance between businesses and politics, and they're scratching each other's back, right? And this is something progressives fought against, right? But it's hard to break them because the political machine did serve a purpose in the absence of civil service, right? So this is a big deal. This right here is a big deal. Now, you get into So that's going to be, now industrialization, real quick, what time we got left? So you got the urbanization, you got the immigration, industrialization. Now this is after the Civil War. After the Civil War is out of the way, this is where the American Industrial Revolution really takes place. Remember now, the original Industrial Revolution started in England, right? The original Industrial Revolution, the English started it around 1750 in England. The English started the Industrial Revolution with the making of textiles, okay? The American Revolution really takes off after the Civil War, right? Once you get that out of the way. So what you get here is, some of you, I don't know if some of you saw, I think HBO played it. It's called something like The Men Who Built America, right?
Yeah, the History Channel. Really good.
What was it?
History Channel.
Was the History Channel did? And they did, like, you know, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, right? They did what were called the captains of industries. Now here's the thing about these guys who so-called built America: the railroads, the banks, the industries, the iron and steel industry, all this stuff. If you look favorably on them, you call them captains of industry. If you don't like them that much, they are referred to as robber barons. So I think they're probably a little above, right? They're kind of a little above. These are guys are rough, tough, profane characters who'll do anything to build their economic empire. Anything whatsoever. Okay, these are not blue bloods. These are self-made men who will do anything to carve out an economic empire, whether it be in banking, whether it be in iron and steel, whether it be in coal, whether it be in oil, all right, just to name a few. Now this goes along also with American invention, because this is where you see American inventors, both black and white, by the way. You got some very prominent black inventors, you got white inventors, all in this. This is kind of the age where the United States really takes off after the Civil War. Rapid urbanization, the immigrants provide the cheap labor, and then you got these guys who are building these economic empires. All right, very, very quickly. Just name a couple out of the, there's a million of them I could name. I've got videos up on this. Just some huge, big figures. Got Cornelius Vanderbilt. He was, Vanderbilt's a big name, still is around. Vanderbilt, rough, tough, profane guy. He built something like 5,000 miles of railroad track. He was into ships. He was into shipping big time. Extremely rich. I mean, really super. Keep in mind something about these guys. They kept every cent they had. In a sense, they still do. But there's no what? There's no tax. There's no income tax. They're keeping every dime they make. There's no income tax or anything like that. So they're keeping just about everything they make. So they become just incredibly wealthy. You know, unbelievable wealth. A tough, profane guy, but he builds the railroads, he builds the shipping industry. He gave a bunch of help. He helped. We got a college right down here in Tennessee called what? Vanderbilt University. It's named that for a reason, because he gave him a bunch of money. He gave him a bunch of money. J.P. Morgan is what?
What?
Well, mainly, we'll get to the oil guy here in a minute. J.P. Morgan's mainly banking, railroads, iron and steel, because he bought out Carnegie. Bought out Andrew Carnegie. Because banking, railroads, super rich. Super rich. Right? Huge. I just kind of hit some here. Of course, John D. Rockefeller is what? He built the what? Oil industry, right? Petroleum, oil industry, ground up oil industry. Keep in mind that these guys are sometimes called robber barons is because they create monopolies. which stifles competition. We don't like monopolies because it stifles competition, right? These guys build monopolies. John D. Rockefeller will control 90% of the oil industry in this country. That's not good. That means he controls everything. Okay? So you'll have a real problem with monopolies in this country. Right? That's going to become a big issue. That'll become a big political issue. Andrew Carnegie. Who's that coming? Andrew Carnegie builds what? Iron and steel. Now he was an immigrant from Scotland. Came over when he was about 10, 12 years old. Built the iron and steel industry where? Got a football team named there. Pittsburgh, right? Pittsburgh Steelers are called the Steelers for a reason. That's where Andrew Carnegie built the iron and steel industry, was in Pittsburgh. Poor immigrant boy from Scotland, built the iron and steel industry, and then sold out to J.P. Morgan. Sold out to J.P. Morgan, which became U.S. Steel, which became the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. U.S. Steel became the first billion-dollar industry in American history when John D. Rockefeller bought out Carnegie. The first trillion-dollar industry is who? Matter of fact, they just passed another mark.
Was it Amazon?
That's what I keep hearing. It's actually Apple. Yeah, it's actually Apple. Amazon's up there. Apple, but Apple just passed another mark. It was like, I just saw it. They passed another big high mark, watermark. It was that no corporation's done before. I forget what it was now. It was like the first one that achieved 100 trillion or something crazy. It was some crazy number, right? It's just nuts. It's just crazy. Andrew Carnegie. See, these guys, here's the thing. Then you get the inventors, right? Of course, the big one is Thomas Edison, right? What did he make? What's his claim to fame? Light bulb, photographs, movies. He had like all kinds of patents, right? Now, he had a kind of a committee of guys, by the way. He had African Americans whom he hired that helped him develop his patents. Right, but then you get some great American inventors. You get, and he formed his kind of like his own inventing company. They just had patent after patent after patent after patent after patent. Just amazing. You get some, in the realm of telephone, right? That's a big one. Who invents the telephone? Alexander Graham Bell. Right? He was Scottish too. Alexander Graham Bell, right? Invented the telephone. You get it. This is the age of American invention. I mean, you could go through so many. You get African American Garrett A. Morgan, huge. Where's that music coming? Is it just coming through on the vent? It's kind of nice, but I just wonder what it's doing. Garrett A. Morgan became very wealthy. He invented the gas mask. African American was on a stamp, but invented gas mask. He invented, which saved a lot of lives in World War I, and also miners who got trapped, because the gas mask saved a lot of lives. In that, he was also, interestingly enough, in 1923, he saw an accident at an intersection. I believe he might have been around Columbus, Ohio. I think that's where he was from. But he saw an accident at an intersection, and he came up with the invention of the automatic traffic stop. He invented the automatic traffic stop. He made a patent of it. And General Electric, he sold it to General Electric. Now, this doesn't sound like much money today, but he sold it to General Electric for $40,000. That was considered a lot of money then, though. And he was quite rich. And he made all kinds of inventions, cosmetics, all kinds of stuff. You get a number of these guys. Garrett Morgan, Lewis Howard Latimer, Another African American, Lewis Latimer. Lewis Latimer, and you get several of them. I'm just kind of picking some up, but he's the one who did the fluorescent lights. He invented the fluorescent lights, which was kind of, on top of Edison and what Edison. The thing about Edison, where he kind of lost out on, is that he ran up against a guy named Tesla, Nikola Tesla. You've heard of him? He's a little weird. Tesla, he was originally from Serbia, I think. He was more theoretical. The Tesla, of course, was a great inventor, originally from Serbia, a real genius, but he was just kind of odd. But he and Tesla and Edison were real competitors. Edison bet that electricity that was coming in that we would use direct current. And he bet on direct current. Tesla bet on what? What do we use today? We don't use direct current. We use alternating current in our electricity. We use alternating current. And that's what, so Edison kind of lost out on that. But, I'm kind of flipping out some, so just real quick here. And I'll end it with this part at least. I'll end it just with this. Keep in mind, there's kind of the good and bad with this, and I'll kind of end this with it. On the one hand, they are the captains of industry who build American industry into what a lot of it is today. And they engage in what we call philanthropy, especially Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie gave away almost all his